never allowed to speak at the table for a decade, a Lakota chief asked her what she thought. The treaty papers were already spread across the table when I noticed she was not in the room. I had been watching the door without meaning to, watching for her. Colonel Aldrich was talking. He was always talking about the boundary lines, about the survey stakes, about the government's firm position, and I was nodding in the way I'd learned to nod over 23 years of this work, which is the nod that says I'm listening without saying I agree. But part of me was counting the men at the table and coming up one short. Chief Tall Crane was there. His son Yellowstone sat behind him against the wall. The bureau agent, Fitch, was mopping his collar with a handkerchief in the August heat. But the one who actually knew both languages, not trading post Lakota, not the rough-hand signs most of these men relied on, but real Lakota, the kind you carry in your chest, she wasn't there. Her name was Walks Quiet. She was Tall Crane's daughter, and she had been translating at Council Fire since she was 16 years old, and she was 32 now, and she had been doing it so long that nobody in these rooms ever said her name anymore. The men from Washington talked to Tall Crane. They talked to Fitch. They talked to me sometimes, though what they usually said to me was "Sit down, Harlan, or we'll take it from here." She sat beside her father and moved the words from one world to the other, and nobody thanked her or looked at her directly or asked her a single thing. Ever. Because she was Lakota and she was a woman, and in 1882 those two facts together made a person into furniture. I'd been watching her not be thanked for 11 years. The door opened then and she came in. She'd been standing outside, I realized later, just standing in the heat, in the dust, in the shadow of the doorway, because no one had thought to offer her a seat during the recess. She walked to her place behind her father's chair. She did not look at me. She had a way of entering a room that was neither hurried nor slow. A walk that said, "I am here because my father needs me and for no other reason, and don't mistake my presence for welcome." Aldrich started talking again. I watched Fitch watch her. Fitch was the kind of man who watched her the way men look at things they've decided they can take, and every time he did it my hands went flat on my tabletop. I had a reputation in this territory for being careful and quiet, and I had worked hard to earn it, and I had spent years not doing what I wanted to do when Fitch looked at Walks Quiet the way Fitch looked at Walks Quiet. Tall Crane raised his hand. He said something and everyone looked at her. She translated without expression. "The chief says the northern boundary cannot move." He has said this 3 times. He would like the colonel to explain why it must be said a 4th time. Aldrich went red. Fitch pressed his lips together. I looked at the map on the table and put my finger on the creek line and said, "Colonel, the survey of 1879 already confirmed the northern boundary. The chief is correct. If you want this to hold, you don't move the line." I said it quietly enough that it didn't sound like a challenge. That was the skill after 23 years, making the true thing sound obvious. Aldrich looked at me with the look that meant, "We'll discuss your role here later." I'd been getting that look for 11 years too. He'd never once actually spoken to me about it later, because if he fired me, he'd have nobody who could read a survey chain and also speak enough Sioux to keep these councils from collapsing entirely. The session broke for midday, and everyone shuffled out toward the cook tent, and I went to the creek. I went there when I needed to think, which was often. There was a cottonwood that had been struck by lightning 2 summers back and never quite fell. It leaned on another tree, balanced, half its bark gone white and silver. I liked that tree. I used to sit against it and look at the water and not think about the papers I couldn't change, or the men I couldn't move, or the 11 years of sitting in rooms where my opinion was tolerated the way a draft is tolerated. You feel it. You resent it. You don't invite it. She was already there. Not at the tree. Down the bank, her shoes off, her feet in the shallow water, which surprised me because I had never seen her without her boots. Not in 11 years. She heard me coming and looked over her shoulder and did not move away, which also surprised me, because in 11 years she had maintained a kind of deliberate distance from every man in every camp, myself included, and I had respected it because it was clearly earned. I stopped at the tree. Sorry, I said. Didn't know you came here. She looked back at the water. You come here every midday. I do. So do I, she said. We've just never been at the same time. I leaned against the cottonwood. The bark was warm and rough through my shirt. I could hear the cook tent a quarter-mile off, the clang of the pot, somebody laughing. Out here it was only the water and the cottonwood leaves moving. Your father's holding firm, I said. My father is always firm. A pause. He will not move the line, and he should not move the line, and Aldrich knows this, but he has superiors who do not, and he is afraid of his superiors. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. No heat in it. That's exactly what it is, I said. She looked at me then. It was a quick look, not suspicious, not warm, just assessing. You've been doing this longer than Aldrich. Long enough. Longer than Fitch. Much longer. Then why does Aldrich speak and you sit? It wasn't quite a question, the way she said it. I thought about a few different answers and discarded them. Because I told a colonel he was wrong in 1871, and he put a note in a file, and that note is apparently permanent. She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. The creek moved. A heron was standing in the shallows upstream, motionless, waiting. They don't ask you either, I said. I hadn't planned to say it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, no. You know things nobody else in that room knows. You know what your father means when he pauses before he speaks. You know when the words he chooses are careful words because he's holding something back. You know when Fitch's translations are wrong, and you correct them without anyone noticing, because if they noticed they'd find a reason to remove you. She turned and looked at me fully then. It was the first time in 11 years she had looked at me the way you look at a person you're actually considering. I've noticed you notice, she said. I spend a lot of time in rooms watching what nobody's watching, I said. Hazard of the work. She pulled her feet from the water and set them on the bank. The heron upstream hadn't moved. My father says you're the only honest man at those tables. That sat on me a moment. He said that. He's said it for years. She looked at the water again. He says you argue for the right thing in a voice too quiet for anyone to hear. I didn't know what to do with that. 23 years of being the man who sits down, and here was tall Crane, a man I respected more than anyone I'd known in this work, saying my name to his daughter over years' worth of fires I wasn't at. I said, tell me something. She waited. When you translate, when Aldrich says something and you carry it across, do you ever change a word? Not wrong, just different, because the word he used doesn't have what he means. She was still for a moment. Then, yes. What do you do with the difference? I choose the word that says what he should have meant, if he were trying to reach an agreement rather than win an argument. Does your father know? My father taught me to do it. She looked at me sidelong. Does that trouble you? No, I said. It's the most diplomatic thing anyone in that room is doing. She was quiet again. The creek sound was low and steady. After a while she said, Fitch's translation this morning was wrong. The word he used for boundary, he used the trade word, which means a line that moves. My father's word meant a line that does not. I felt that settle into me like a key into a lock. That's why Aldrich thinks there's room to negotiate. Yes. And you didn't correct it. She looked at me. I said, because if you'd corrected Fitch openly, Fitch would have made sure you weren't in the room tomorrow. Yes, she said. I pushed off the cottonwood. I'll correct it, I said. This afternoon. I'll bring it up as a surveyor's concern about terminology precision. Nobody will know where it came from. She looked at me for a long moment. The heron upstream lifted from the water and was gone. She said, you do that. It wasn't a question either. I've been doing it for 11 years, I said. Small corrections, worded carefully, nobody notices. I've noticed, she said. She put her boots back on and stood up. She was tall for a woman of any background, and she stood straight, and when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes that I'd seen her give her father in unguarded moments, a kind of clear-eyed measure that landed as respect. Nobody had looked at me that way in a long time, not since my wife Alina passed, 7 years back, and Alina had been the last person on earth who bothered to look. She said, "Thank you, Harlan." First time she'd used my name in 11 years. I walked back to the cook tent and ate something I couldn't taste and thought about the creek and the heron and the word for a line that does not move. That afternoon I raised the terminology issue. I framed it as a surveyor's concern. I laid the two words side by side, the trade word and the right word, and I said the record should reflect which the chief had intended, because the government would want the agreement unambiguous, and Aldrich could hardly argue with that. Fitch knew what I was doing. He looked at me across the table with flat eyes, and I met them and held them until he looked away. Tall Crane said something. Everyone looked at her. She translated. "The chief says the corrected word is correct. He is glad someone in this room understands the importance of precision." Fitch's jaw moved once. Aldrich wrote something on his paper. I didn't look at her, she didn't look at me. But under the table my hand was resting on my knee, and I could feel my own heartbeat in my palm, which hadn't happened in a long time either. The session ended late. The sun was going orange over the hills, and everyone was filing out in their separate directions. The government men toward the tent Aldrich had set up for them, the bureau men toward Fitch's wagon, Tall Crane's people toward the camp they'd made in the cottonwood shade to the north. I was standing beside my horse, checking the cinch, not ready to go anywhere in particular, when I heard someone behind me. She'd waited until the yard was empty. She stood about 10 feet away with her hands together in front of her, not quite at rest. She said, "My father wants to speak to you this evening." "All right," I said. "Not at the table, at the fire." "I'll come." She nodded. Then she said, "He's never asked any of the government men to the fire." I took that in. "I'll come," I said again, because I didn't know what else to say, and that was the true thing. She started to walk away and then stopped. She looked back at me. The orange light was on her face and on the silver in her father's language, which was her language, and she said, "He's going to ask you to stay. After the treaty is signed, he'll ask you to represent his people's interests to the government, to live at the edge of the territory and be the voice they need when they need one." I wasn't sure what to do with my hands. I held the reins without moving. "And what'll you say," she said, "when he asks?" "What would you say," I said, "if you were advising him?" She held my eyes for a moment. "Then, I'd tell him you'd say yes." She turned and walked toward the northern camp. I watched her go. The last of the orange light was leaving the hills, and the first of the dark was coming in from the east, and I stood there beside my horse a long time, longer than I needed to, holding the reins. At the fire I sat across from Tall Crane, and he spoke, and she translated, and then she asked me questions of her own, and when I answered she did not translate those. She just listened, and her father watched her listen. And once, only once, Tall Crane looked at me across the fire with a look I could not fully read, except that it was not hostile and it was not cold, and it had in it something I recognized slowly as something like permission. He asked me to stay. I said yes. She translated, but her eyes were already on the fire, and I looked at the fire too, and the wood popped once and sent up a small fall of sparks, and the night was very large around us, and I had not felt my own weight in years the way I felt it then. Not burden, not erasure, just weight. The weight of a man who is somewhere real. That was August. By October the treaty was signed and ratified, which was the fastest any treaty in my experience had ever moved, and the reason was that the language was clean and precise and unambiguous, and when the Bureau later tried to argue room for interpretation on the Northern Line, the record showed clearly there was none. Fitch filed a complaint about my conduct at the council. Nobody in Washington did anything about it. The note went in a file. I set up in a cabin 2 miles from Tall Crane's winter camp, on the east edge of the territory, close enough to hear from them and far enough to have my own ground. November was cold early that year. The cabin was solid. Previous man had built it from good timber, but there were gaps at the windows. I spent the first week filling with cut wood and rags, and a kind of clay the soil threw up near the creek bank. Hard work, good work, the kind where you can see the evidence of it at the end of the day. She came in November. Not for the reason I thought, not with any particular errand. She arrived on a gray morning with a bag over her shoulder, and she said she was going to a settlement a half-day's ride east and she'd stop coming back if I had no objection. She said it matter-of-factly. She said it the way she said most things, which was without excess. I said I had no objection. She unloaded the bag, which had in it dried meat, and a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, and a book in Lakota which she set on the shelf beside my 2 English ones. She made coffee on my stove. She didn't ask. She just made it, and when it was done she handed me a cup and poured one for herself and sat at the table and looked out the window at the gray sky and the gray hill and said, "It's going to snow by afternoon." "Looks like it," I said. We drank the coffee. It was the best coffee I'd had since Aliner's, and I did not say so because some things should not be said too early. She left around noon with the bag half empty, and I stood at the cabin door and watched her ride out south. The snow started before she was out of sight, light and early, not the heavy storm kind, but the kind that comes down quiet and says winter is here, and there is nothing to be done about it. I went inside and put more wood on and looked at the Lakota book on my shelf between my 2 English ones. She stopped again in December, January, February, each time with something in the bag and no stated reason for the stop except the stop itself, and each time we drank coffee and she told me what was happening in the camp and I told her what letters had come from Washington and what I'd done about them, and she sometimes suggested different approaches, which were always better than mine, and I used them. In March I asked her to review a letter before I sent it. She made 3 changes. All 3 were exactly right. In April I asked her to sit with me when I drafted the quarterly report to the Bureau. She sat. She looked over my shoulder and said the sentences I was struggling with plainly, easily, the way she carried language in her chest, and I wrote them down. In May she came without the bag. She came and knocked, and when I opened the door she looked at me for a moment in the early light and said, "My father is asking again." "What's he asking?" I said. "He's asking if you intend to be here in the winter." "Tell him yes." She nodded once. She said he wanted to know. "I know he did," I said. "Sit down, I'll make the coffee this time." She sat down. I made the coffee. Outside the spring was coming up green over the hill, the first real green after a long winter, and the morning light was clean and direct, and it came through the window and lay across the table between us, and she wrapped her hands around the cup I set in front of her and looked out at the green hill, and there was something easy in her face. Not soft. Nothing about her was ever soft, but easy. The set of her jaw was easy, and the line of her shoulders was easy, and she looked like a woman who had, after a long time, arrived at a place she did not feel the need to leave. I sat down across from her. I put my hands around my own cup. The hill was very green. She said, without looking away from the window, "They're going to try to revise the northern boundary again, next autumn. There's a man in Washington named Carver who has been writing to Fitch." "I know about Carver," I said. "What do you know?" "I know he has a surveying company with a government contract, and the contract is more profitable if the line moves. I know he's been bribing 2 members of the Land Commission since 1880. She looked at me. "I have letters," I said. "Originals. A man in the Bureau mailed them to me last winter because he thought someone ought to have them who'd use them." "You've had them since winter," she said. "Since January. And you didn't tell me." I was waiting for the right time. She held my eyes for a moment. I could see her deciding something. Then she said, "That's not the reason." I looked at my coffee. "No," I said. "You were waiting," she said quietly, "to see if you could trust me." "I knew I could trust you," I said. "I was waiting to see if I deserved to." The spring light sat between us. Outside, something was moving in the grass on the hillside, a deer or a dog or just the wind. She set her cup down and looked at her hands, and then she looked at me. "Harlan," she said. "I know," I said. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm from the cup and dry from the winter, and she held my hand flat under hers, and I did not move. I did not look up right away. I looked at the table, at our hands, at the way the light moved across the wood. Then I looked up. She was looking at me. Not the quick assessing look of the creek bank, not the translated distance look from across council tables. She looked at me the way her father had looked at me across the fire, without hostility and without coldness, but with something more now, something that cost her something to let me see, which was the thing that mattered. Not a gift you give easily. A gift you give once freely when you've decided the person is worth the giving. "The letters," she said. "We'll use them in the fall when Carver moves." "We'll use them," I said. She lifted her hand. She picked up her cup. She looked back out the window at the green hill. We stayed at the table until the coffee was gone and the light had moved off the wood and the deer or the dog or the wind had finished with the grass on the hill. We talked about the boundary and the letters and the autumn and the ways the Bureau might come at it and the ways we'd answer each. She spoke and I wrote things down. I spoke and she refined them. It was the most useful conversation I'd had in 23 years of this work. And when she stood to go, I walked with her to her horse, and she checked the cinch herself and pulled herself up and looked down at me in the spring light. "Tell your father I'll be here in the winter," I said. "Tell him yourself," she said. "Come to the fire on Sunday." She rode south. I stood in the yard and watched until she was over the hill. The green was everywhere and the light was plain and clean, and I stood in it a while, the way you stand in weather that's been a long time coming, not moving, not yet, just feeling the full weight of it on your face. I had learned over 23 years that certain things cannot be pushed. The creek finds its own level. The treaty line holds or it doesn't. A man of 61, hard used and mostly invisible, does not ask for what nobody's offering. He tends his work. He shows up. He holds the line as long as the line is worth holding. But sometimes a woman crosses a table and puts her hand on yours and looks at you the way you've been waiting without knowing you were waiting. And the thing to do is simply not move away. I didn't move away. The hill was green. The light was clean. In the cabin, my coffee cup was still on the table next to hers, and on the shelf between my two English books, there was a book in Lakota that I had been slowly teaching myself to read. I went inside. I picked up the book. I sat down at the table in the afternoon light and opened it to where I'd left the ribbon, and I read.